What's up guys, Agent here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Nightblade tank. So the Nightblade tank has actually seen quite a nice buff overall to its overall abilities to sort of be a tank. There have been quite a few changes to the abilities that really help it be a solid tanking option now. There was one kind of quasi-nerf that was sort of adjusted a little bit in Elsweyr, so it wasn't quite as bad of a nerf. But generally speaking, Nightblade tanks are actually in a very good spot right now in terms of Elsweyr, in terms of group utility. So a lot of high-end groups are actually playing around with bringing a Nightblade off tank in order to get some of the group debuffs and buffs that the Nightblade has. So Nightblade's definitely come a long way from past patches now with Elsweyr. So, like the rest of our build videos, we're going over gear, skills, attributes, everything you need to know to basically recreate this build yourself. Now, because we are a support role, we will need to have a lot of different sets and a lot of different abilities on our bars in order to, be able to really help support the group. So rather than doing a really parse or anything like that, because again we're a support role, we don't have a parse, instead we'll be taking a lot of time instead to talk about the different sets, when you would use them, why you would use them, as well as your abilities as well, when you would use your certain abilities and things like that. From there, I'll talk about a little bit behind the philosophy of tanking. Now, I do not have a Nightblade tank on live, so we are in the PTS here. But hopefully there are going to be a few high-end streamers that will be using Nightblade tanks. I don't know of any right now off the top of my head that are streaming vet endgame content on a Nightblade tank, but hopefully there will be a few coming up soon here. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here first with our gear. So this is only one potential combination of sets. Again, I will be going over each of the different sets that you're going to have on hand, when you would use them, why you would use them. So starting off first with our monster helm, we're going to stick with Warden's Dusk. This is a pretty safe monster helm set, always going to be consistent and always going to be really nice to have on a tank. This comes from Imperial City Prison, so you do need to have access to the Imperial City DLC in order to get this set. Pretty nice, it just gives up straight up resistances to everybody within 8 meters of you whenever you take damage, so it just gives you a lot of resistances as well. So if you want to play a little bit selfishly, but also provide a little bit of additional resistances to your melee DPS, then this is a very solid choice to have. A lot of progression groups like to have Lord Warden on one of their tanks for the additional mitigation there. For our first set here, we're going with Perfected Yolnahkriin. You can go with the imperfect version if you would like. For Yolnahkriin specifically, unlike False Gods and Lakesti, the difference between Perfected and Non-Perfect is pretty much non-existent, because the only difference is that maximum health on the 5-piece. So while you will have a little bit of additional tankiness with the Perfected set, it's not really that big of a deal, because you can always make up that health elsewhere by putting more points into your health attributes, maybe using another health enchant rather than a Prismatic enchant, and so on. So it doesn't really matter which version you use, the perfected or the imperfect. You just got to make sure that whichever version you decide to use, you have to use all 5 pieces in that version, so you can't mix and match these two sets here. This comes from Sunspire, so you do need to have access to the Elsweyr expansion in order to get this set. So this is the only set in the game that provides minor courage, and it only applies it when you taunt an enemy, so only tanks can really make use of this set here. Minor courage does stack with major courage because they are different buffs, so really nice to have if you really want to min-max and get as much damage as you possibly can out of your group. It also gives you some nice survivability as well. You have 2 max health, 1 max stamina, and minor aegis as well. So really nice armor bonuses as a tank. Then our second set is going to be Alkosh. So this is still the classic staple tank set here. It comes from Maw of Lorcage, so you do need to have access to the Thieves Guild DLC in order to use this set, to farm this set here. So this is still very powerful. It still stacks with all the other sort of resistance debuffs in the game right now, and is the largest unique debuff in the game. So it reduces physical and spell resistance by 3010 whenever you activate a synergy. So very strong. There is only really one instance where you would see Alkosh being used on a DPS, and that's going to be in Sunspire, but that's only because the boss hitbox is a little bit weird right now. Alkosh is definitely best used on a tank, and I've kind of gone over this a little bit in a previous video about why Alkosh is really strong on a tank compared to on a DPS. For our weapon bars, we're going with a sword and board on one bar. It doesn't have to be a sword, it can be any one-hander, so dagger, mace, axe, whatever happens, whatever drop you happen to get. Then our back bar, we're running an ice staff. You could also run a lightning staff, or if you really want to sort of get into min-maxing, you can also run a bow as well. But personally, I prefer the ice staff for additional mitigation. The lightning staff is also a very solid choice if you feel like you don't need the additional mitigation, because it does help out with off-balance uptime, as well as the enchant uptime from your blockade as well. So now we're going to be going over the armor attributes, armor traits, and enchants, and then we'll go into the sets. Starting off with our weapons, so I like to have a decisive front bar. Ever since the enchant change was made, where one-handed weapons have half the strength of a typical enchant, there hasn't really been a really solid choice when it comes to front bar enchants or front bar traits for tanks. Decisive is probably the best of making the best out of a worst case scenario here. Just gives you some additional ultimate here. Now, if you want, you don't have to use a Crusher enchant. Depends on who's running the Crusher enchant. Typically, you'll want it on your back bar here, so you maybe want to use something like a Hardening enchant or an Absorb Stamina enchant, or you can use something like a Breaching Poison to get Minor Breach, or you can use like a Fracturing Poison to get Minor Fracture, depending on your DPS makeup here, and as well as what sort of uptime you can expect to see from Power of the Light if you are running a Warden, I should say Templar Healer, or a Stamina Templar DPS. You can also run something like an Absorb Stamina poison as well, or an Absorb Health poison. It's kind of up to you, kind of what you want to do. You have a lot of flexibility with your front bar here, not only with your weapon trait, but also whether you want to use poisons or you want to stick with a typical enchant instead. So I like Decisive, but you can also go with like Infused, Defending. There's plenty of options there. For your back bar, depending on, it actually doesn't really matter whether you're using Ice Staff, Lightning Staff, or a Bow Bar, you still want to have Infused, Crusher, Enchant if you're responsible for running Crusher. If you're not responsible for running Crusher, then you have a little bit more flexibility. I would still run Infused because you will want the Enchant to proc and you want the full strength Enchant, but it's kind of up to you how you want to do it. A lot of people have kind of not a lot, but some people are shifting the Crusher away from the tanks and onto the healers, putting Torug's Crusher on the healers rather than on the tanks. So you kind of have to play it by ear depending on your specific group. For jewelry traits and enchants, you really have three main options for enchants. So I have the Shield Plate enchant, which reduces the cost of block, just helps out my sustain while I'm blocking here. You can also run Magicka regen glyphs to get some more Magicka back. Always going to be very nice to have some very high Magicka regen. You could also run potion cooldown glyphs as well. They reduce the cooldown of your potions by 5 seconds each, so it basically allows you to get more sustain by drinking more potions. Because you're drinking more potions though, it does end up getting quite expensive to maintain your potion addiction, so just be mindful of that if you decide to run a potion cooldown enchant. For jewelry traits, you have a few options here. My personal favorite is to go 2 Triune and 1 Harmony like I have here. I personally like Harmony because it gives me a little bit more resource return when I get an orb or a shard. It also gives me a little bit more healing from the Blood Altar synergy, but you don't need to run Harmony at all. You can triple down on your Triune. You can run Robust, you can run Arcane, you can run Healthy, you can even run Protective if you want to be really, really beefy and kind of forego a couple of resistance buffs and things like that. You have a lot of different options when it comes to traits. You will have to play around a little bit depending on specific content. So for example, Harmony is very strong in Cloud Resp to help combat Baneful Mark with the Blood Altar synergy, but it's not going to be quite as useful in other pieces of content. So you can play around with your traits however you'd like, depending on what you need out of your tank. Now for armor traits and enchants, there's a couple of schools of thoughts here. I'm kind of prescribed towards do sturdy on your small pieces like I have here with max health enchants, and then you do infuse on your large pieces with the prismatic enchants. There are a couple of people, Leofa is one of them for example, who prescribes to the go all sturdy, and I do see the benefit of that too. That also includes your shield as well. There's definitely some benefit for running all sturdy if you want to have a little bit more max stats like I do. I run infused prismatic enchants. We have a lot of different options here when it comes to traits and enchants on your armor. Generally speaking though, sturdy is considered to be one of the best armor traits that you can run as a tank. Infused on your large is also not a bad option either, but those two are the really main traits you're going to be seeing on armor. And then health and prismatics are typically what you see. You can always swap out your health for things like stamina and magicka as needed. So moving on next to our other armor sets you're going to want to have on hand. We'll be going through these in more or less alphabetical order, so just bear in mind while I'm searching for all the sets, because there are a lot of sets that you're going to want to have on hand as a tank. So first we'll go over the dungeon sets here. The first dungeon set we're going to be talking about is going to be Ebon Armory. So this is a very strong set here, one of the best support sets in the game for a tank to wear. It just increases the max health of you and up to 11 group members and 28 meters of you. So it just gives out a lot of additional health, and that allows your DPS to spec a little bit more into pure damage. Don't have to necessarily worry as much about health. So really strong. A lot of groups have at least one tank, one tank running Ebon Armory. It does not stack with itself, so you can't have two Ebon Armories and double up on the buff. So one tank will typically be responsible for Ebon. From there, there is a couple of other sets here you might want to take a look at. First one's going to be Jailer's Tenacity. This is going to be a more selfish set. Comes from Moonhunter Keep, so you do need to have access to the Wolf Hunter DLC in order to grab this set here. Again, selfish. It just gives you major vitality for 5 seconds when you lose 7,000 or more health in a single attack. Can be very situationally useful, so a good example of where this would be really nice to have would be something like Sunspire, Cloud Rest, or even Asylum, where you might be taking 7,000 points of damage or more in a single attack. That way you can gain pretty much major vitality all the time and help out your healer in terms of healing received. This is, again, very selfish, so if you're looking for group support, Jailer's Tenacity is not really a good set for you to run. Another very selfish set that got buffed in Elsweyr is Leeching Plate. This comes from Imperial City Prison, so while you're farming for Lord Warden, you might as well try to get a set of Leeching Plate as well. Very, very selfish. Whenever you take damage, you basically have a chance to summon a Cloud of Leeching Poison, which heals you and deals damage. So for trash bowls, things like Black Rose Prison, Dragonstar Arena, and other 4-man dungeons, Leeching Plate is very, very strong if you're running good DPS 1 tank and you don't have any sort of additional heals. You don't really need to worry about heals with Leeching Plate. You just sort of sit there, take the damage, and it'll heal for you. So everybody that gets hit by Leeching Plate also gets healed. You get that healing done. So very, very powerful set in those situations where you need that self-heal there. Not very good against one large target, but very good against lots of little targets. Moving on to overland sets, there are a few overland sets that you're going to want to have on hand. So starting off here first with Plague Doctor, very, very selfish set, very strong for progression, but other than that, not all that useful. Once you get used to mechanics, I would recommend switching out of Plague Doctor as soon as you can. Just adds a bunch of max health. So base game set, Deshaun, so easy to obtain here, but again, very selfish, good for progression, or if you're maybe looking for a couple of achievements and just want some additional survivability, but in terms of utility, there's basically nothing that Plague Doctor provides there. Moving on, you have Akaviri Dragonguard from Eastmarch. This is another base game set here. It reduces the cost of your ultimate by 15%. This basically makes your Warhorn cheaper. So Nightblades, you don't have any ultimate cost reduction, so this would bring your Warhorn from 250 down to 213. Gives you a little bit better Warhorn uptime, gives you better major force uptime as a result, which ends up resulting in better DPS overall. Don't really see this used all too often. This is a very classic set that people fall back to if there's really no other set to be run on a tank, but still very useful, especially on Nightblades that have very good ultimate generation. And then from there, there's one other set here, Livewire, very, very situationally useful. So this basically applies AoE concussion, which allows people to apply off bounce to a lot of mobs at once. So very useful for trash packs in dungeons and trials where you have smaller enemies, basically non-elite mobs that are able to be set off bounce pretty much indefinitely, but overall not particularly strong. It's very similar to Leeching Plate, it just also adds in concussion as well. So that's it for overland sets. Now for the trial sets, there aren't really that many heavy trial sets that are particularly useful. There is obviously Claw of Yolnahkriin, which we already talked about here. The other one that you might want to consider picking up is going to be, where is it? Eternal Yokeda. This is more used for if you're comfortable running something like a Death Prevention set for no death achievements in dungeons and trials. You can certainly run this if you would like, but generally speaking, you don't need this at all. But it is a set that I have on hand whenever I'm running sort of no death achievements in dungeons, just to play it safe a little bit. I have no qualms using it, but if you have a personal or moral sort of objection to running a set like this for no death achievements, then you don't have to pick this up at all. There are a few other sets that are not heavy armor sets that you're going to want to have on hand as a tank. Starting off first with our dungeon set, there are two sets that you're going to want to have on hand as a tank. First one's going to be Sanctuary. This increases the healing received by 12% for everybody around you within 10 meters. This is from Banner Cell, so base game set here. It's situationally useful, pretty much the exact same situation you would use this as on a healer. So for example, if you're in a stack fight where you have a lot of damage coming in, sanctuaries can be very nice to have on hand. A good example of this would be in Cloud Rest, for example. On the off tank, you might want to wear Sanctuary for progression groups. But generally speaking, it's going to be fairly limited in terms of overall use, but still a nice set to hold on to. Now, this set is a light armor set, so you will need to have jewelry and weapons if you want to wear this set. The other set is going to be the Worm's Raiment from Vault of Madness, another base game set. Reduces the cost of magic abilities by 4% for everybody within 28 meters of you. So again, you want jewelry and weapons. If you don't want this on a healer, then tanks can also wear this as well. Good example of this would be in Asylum, the off tank. If you're doing Asylum +1 or +2, typically speaking, the off tank will be wearing Worm rather than a healer, just because the healers might be out of range if they are kiting Felms' jump. So just want to have this on hand, just in case you want to wear this as a tank, because the healers want to put on a different set here. Then you also have one medium armor set that you're going to want to have to hold on to here. It is, where is it? It is Herskine's Veneer. Here it is. This comes from Celine's Web, basically the stamina version of Worm. Exact same concept as Worm here. If you have a lot of stamina DPS and your healers can't wear Herskine's, then you can wear it instead. It's a medium armor set, so you're going to want to have it on jewelry and weapons. Now there is another set here. I'll need to find it. I believe it is a Cyrodiil set, and it is called, where is it here? So we have Morag Tong, so this is a medium armor set from Cyrodiil. Just whenever you deal direct damage, you cause the enemy to take 10% more damage from poison damage. So if you have a lot of stamina DPS, Morag Tong is a good set to have on hand to increase overall DPS. And then you also have, actually, it is not in Cyrodiil, it might actually be in the Telvar sets. It is going to be, yes it is, Powerful Assault. So this is another medium armor set from Imperial City with Telvar. So you can actually buy this off of guild traders, or you can just farm it yourself if you have access to the Imperial City and farm some Telvar that way. This basically gives a unique increase to weapon and spell damage that stacks with major and minor courage here whenever you cast an assault ability. So on a tank, it typically be something like Vigor or Caltrops. This will give it to up to 3 allies within 10 meters of you for 15 seconds. So there is a little bit of weirdness when it comes to how it applies it, which allies it chooses to apply the buff to. Nephis made a very great video on how Powerful Assault works, so if you're interested in that, I highly recommend checking out Nephis's video there. He will do a fantastic job sort of explaining and showing you guys how Powerful Assault works. Those are all the sets that you pretty much are going to want to have on hand as a healer. In terms of Monster Helm sets, you have a lot of different Monster Helm sets that you're going to want to definitely farm up here. So starting off up top here, I'm just going to go down the line here. First one's going to be Swarm Mother. So Nightblades do not have a native source of chains. The only chaining ability that you have is going to be Silver Leash, which costs stamina. So you kind of want to save stamina to block. So in instances where you are going to expect to chain in a lot of adds, so for example Black Rose Prison, maybe Dragonstar Arena, then you might want to consider running Swarm Mother. So when you block an attack from somebody who's further than 8 meters of you, you basically pull the enemy to you. It does have a cooldown of 1 second, which isn't that bad, and it only pulls one enemy at a time, but it is very nice because all you have to do is just taunt an enemy who's far away and it'll automatically pull them towards you as long as it is off cooldown. So better to use Swarm Mother than to run Silver Leash in many instances. Moving on, Earthgore is a very selfish set now. It was changed in Elsweyr to only affect one target, the person with the lowest health within the area here. So in terms of healing sets, it's not particularly strong anymore, but as a tank, if it does happen to proc off you, then it will typically be proccing on you as well, because you will typically be the lowest health person within the area of effect. So if you want a nicer burst heal, definitely consider wearing Earthgore. It's definitely weaker now than it was in the past, but it's still a possible option for tanks in more selfish / progression groups. Moving on, you have Bloodspawn. This is a base game set from Veteran Spell Clutch 2. This is probably the only Monster Helm set that's actually pretty decent for a tank from the base game. So when you take damage, you have a chance to generate ultimate and increase your resistances. So Basically just a ultimate battery. You're taking a lot of damage, so even though it's only a 60% chance, it actually procs fairly often. Don't really rely on this for your resistance buffs, you're going to rely on this more for the burst of ultimate generation instead. Thurvokun is another set you want to have on hand. This comes from Fang Lair, so you do have access to the Dragon Bones DLC. This basically creates a giant pool of desecrated bile for 8 seconds, and it applies minor main minor defile to anybody who gets hit by it, and also deals a little bit of damage. So very nice for an AoE minor main. Nightblades don't really have a good source of AoE minor main. There is one ability they can use to apply it, but Thurvokun is going to be a little bit more consistent, and it also covers a much wider area as well. So really nice for trash pulls where you have to apply minor main to a lot of different things and don't necessarily want to run dark shades at all. Next we have Vycosa. So this is very situationally useful. So when you bash an enemy you've taunted, you apply major maim to them for 3 seconds. This can occur every 15 seconds. So really nice if you're anticipating large amounts of damage all at once. If you know when it's going to happen, you can bash them while wearing Vycosa, and you can reduce the damage that's incoming. So good examples of where Vycosa might be very helpful would be in progression groups, in Veteran Sunspire to kind of reduce the damage from the Dragon Breath. You can also use it in Asylum. If you are already off tanking, you're tanking Lotus or Thelms, you can bash them when, for example, Lotus deals his Defiling Blast, so whoever gets hit does take less damage on that first 2 blast hits. So really nice set overall, but definitely very situationally useful. Next we have Stonekeeper, which is a more selfish set, so when you block an attack you gain a charge stack, and when you gain 6 charges you heal for 5350 base, and you also restore 5350 stamina and magicka. This can occur basically every 20 seconds, so this is just a very nice sustain set overall. It has a very unique one piece where it's basically a tri-stat armor bonus there. So very nice for selfish sort of tanking builds, but overall not particularly useful for group support. And finally, you have Symphony of Blades. So whenever you heal an ally who's under 50% of their primary resource being magicka or stamina, you grant them Meridia's Favor, restoring 2325 magicka or stamina, whichever is higher, every second for 6 seconds. So you have to heal an ally here, so if you are running Refreshing Path, then that'll proc it. It doesn't prop on yourself, unfortunately, and it's a very nice sustain tool. So typically speaking, a lot of endgame groups will have multiple supports running Symphony of Blades, so you can get multiple procs going, which really helps out the overall sustain of DPS. It allows them to spec a little bit less into regen, more into just raw damage, if they know they can get Symphony proc to get their sustain back that way. So that is all of the sets, monster helms, and otherwise that you're going to want to have on hand as a tank. A lot of them are listed down in the description below, so you can just check them out and farm all of those sets there. Now onto our character sheet. I am a Nord. Nords are considered to be one of the best races for tanking. Generally speaking, race doesn't really matter all too much for tanking. I tank on a Dark Elf, for example, a Dark Elf Dragon Knight, and I have had very limited issues when it comes to overall tanking. I've pretty much tanked everything in the game right now, with very little issue once I learn the mechanics and know the strategies involved. So don't really worry too much about race overall, but the best race is going to be Nord, Argonians, and Imperials. So Nords, as a race, they get additional max health, 2000 max health, and I believe 1000 max stamina. They get a nice amount of resistances, 60 additional resistances for both spell and physical, and they also get some ultimate generation whenever they take damage, so just gives you a little bit more ultimate to play around with. Imperials get 2000 max health, 2000 max stamina. They also get 3% cost reduction to all abilities, including ultimates. They also get 333 magicka health and stamina back whenever they deal damage. I believe it's every 5 seconds. So a little bit of additional sustain bonus there with Imperials, and just more raw stats compared to the Nords. Argonians, they don't get quite as much in terms of max stats. They get 1000 max health, 1000 max magicka, so you do need to put a little bit more into stamina if you are running an Argonian. Argonians really shine is in also in sustain, so they get a potion passive which restores 4000 magicka, health, and stamina, all 3 whenever you drink any potion. So this basically allows you to use things like trash pots and treat them essentially as tri-stat potions. So it just helps out your sustain. If you combine it with crafted tri-stat potions, you get a huge boost of resources every 45 seconds, or fewer if you're running potion cooldown lifts there. Argonians also get some additional healing done bonuses, so your self heals are also going to be a little bit stronger on yourself. But like I mentioned earlier, race doesn't really play that big of a role when it comes to overall tanking ability. A lot of tanks in the endgame community run orcs, for example, for the additional movement speed, the additional stamina, and the weapon damage, so they can off DPS in fights where they can do so as an off tank. So a lot of flexibility when it comes to race. For attributes, for this particular setup here, I have 40 health, 10 stamina, 14 magicka. This is going to vary depending on your race, because each race has a little bit different overall max stats. So for example, on my Dark Elf, I get magicka and stamina, so I have to invest more into health compared to magicka and stamina. So the general rule of thumb is you kind of want to hit around 35k max health before buffs, so before toughness and before Ebon, if you are not running Ebon. And then from there, make sure your stamina is higher than your magicka. Try to get around 20k if you can, magicka and stamina. You can obviously adjust these as needed. So for example, if you're progressing, you need some more survivability, you can put a little bit more points into health. If you feel very comfortable with your survivability, you can shift some points out of health, put them into like magicka or stamina. So a lot of flexibility when it comes to your max stats here. But the general rule is 35k max health, make sure stamina is higher than magicka. We are a vampire for the additional magicka regen and stamina regen. That's at stage 2. Stage 3, we get the Undeath passive, which gives us some damage mitigation when we fall below a certain percentage of health. Very, very nice, and even though we are taking more damage from fire, we're a tank, so it doesn't do that much damage to begin with, so it's not actually that much increase in overall damage. Running the Atronach for additional magicka regen. A lot of our buffs use magicka, so we want the Atronach to basically give ourselves some more magicka back every 2 seconds, so we're able to continue to use our buffs. Then we are using purple food. This increases max health, max stamina, and max magicka here. Moving on to our skill bars. I do have to change out this skill here for a different skill. So we'll put on Refreshing Path for right now, or actually Mass Hysteria. So for our front bar, this is a sword and board bar. We have Pierce Armor, Heroic Slash, Dark Cloak, Balance. This is a flex spot here. So I have Mass Hysteria here. That's because Fear was changed a little bit, and I'll talk about it in a little bit here. And we have Incapacitating Strike. There are a couple of ultimates you can use here on the front bar instead of Incap. On the back bar, this is the Staff or Bow bar. You have Inner Rage, Lotus Fan, Leeching Strikes, Merciless Resolve, Mirage, and you have Aggressive Warhorn. Out of all these abilities here, Lotus Fan and Mirage are two flex spots, so to speak here. I would actually argue that Mirage is not really that big of a flex spot. This is your major source of major ward and major resolve. It also gives major evasion, minor ward, minor resolve. So this is basically all of your defensive buffs wrapped up into one move. So I would not really consider this a flex spot, but some people don't use Mirage on a Nightblade tank. So really quick, because there have been a lot of changes with Nightblades in terms of overall tanking abilities. So first, Fear. So Fear used to cause enemies to run away from you. Now it causes them to cower in fear, so they stay in place. So now Mass Hysteria is actually a very good root move. It's a hard CC, so you can just cast it, and it basically fears them in place for 5 seconds. So really, really nice. Changed, really nice buff to Nightblade tanks. So Mass Hysteria is a very good hard CC now, something that Nightblades have severely been lacking in for quite a while. And then for the back bar, Lotus Fan applies minor vulnerability for 8 seconds. So this basically frees up a slot on the healers, so healers don't have to run IA anymore. And so you just keep using this every 8 seconds to apply minor vulnerability. IA is still going to be a little bit more consistent because you will have to use resources to use Lotus Fan or the other morph, which I believe is Ambush, which uses stamina. So IA is still going to be more consistent, so for progression groups or groups that don't have Nightblade tanks, obviously they're going to be running IA, but if you have the ability to do so, definitely try to use Lotus Fan or Ambush here for the minor vulnerability. Leeching Strikes obviously for the sustain, but Merciless Resolve, they did change, or I should say added on additional effect for Merciless Resolve along with the other changes that they've made here. So now you reduce damage taken by 3% for every light or heavy attack that you deal up to 5 times. Basically, when you have your bow proc active, you have a flat 15% reduction to damage. This is calculated outside of the damage mitigation formula, so it's a true 15% damage mitigation, which makes Nightblade tanks incredibly tanky now. And this buff lasts even if you happen to drop Merciless Resolve, as long as you don't use your bow proc. So if you get your 5 light attacks off, you have your bow proc, you have a 15% damage reduction, you can let it drop off, and as long as you stay within combat, then you have this 15% damage mitigation. So very, very powerful tool now for Nightblade tanks, makes them incredibly tanky now. It's not known yet whether the damage reduction outside of the damage mitigation formula is a bug or not, but for right now, we're assuming that it is working as intended. We've already talked about Mirage here. Now you do have several abilities here that you can swap out. So I've already mentioned that you have a few flex spots, Master Stereo for example, Lotus Fan if your healers want to run IA instead for more consistent minor vulnerability, Mirage if for whatever reason you don't want to run Mirage. So you have quite a few options here when it comes to overall abilities. So going through our class abilities first, not much here. You can potentially run Mark Target here for the Major Fracture, Major Breach, but your Taunt already does that for you, so not particularly useful here. Under the Shadow line, you have a couple abilities here. So you have Refreshing Path, which is a nice heal. So if you're running Symphony of Blades, I recommend running Refreshing Path in order to get a proc off from Symphony. Otherwise, you're going to have to run something like Vigor instead. Refreshing Path is a very nice heal, not just to you, but also your allies. So again, if you're wearing Symphony, I highly recommend running Refreshing Path as your source of healing. We already talked about Mass Hysteria as a hard CC. Then we have Dark Shade. So this helps deal a little bit of additional damage, but it also inflicts minor maim to anything that the Shade damages. The Shade, Dark Shade specifically, has an AoE move that it sometimes does. So this is a source of AoE minor maim. Not particularly strong compared to something like Thurvokun, because it does use up an ability slot versus Thurvokun, which is just an armor slot, but it is an option here. Minor maim is already applied via Heroic Slash, so Dark Shade's not as useful on a single target, because you can just use Heroic Slash instead for that minor maim. Under the Siphoning line, not much here. You can run Debilitate if you would like for the minor Magicka Steel that has been added on to it, but typically speaking your healers will have that covered with something like Ellie Drain or Radiant Aura if they're a Templar healer, or even Debilitate if you have a Magicka Nightblade who is running Debilitate instead of Crippling Grasp. Your ultimates, each of these ultimates has its own spot as the front bar flex ultimate. So Incap gives you a little bit of additional magic and stamina back whenever you deal damage with a light or heavy attack. Does require the enemy to have negative effect active on them, but you have Heroic Slash on them at all times, so minor maim does count, so you will always be getting that magic and stamina back with light and heavy attacks. Bolstering Darkness provides major protection, very useful in a lot of different fights where you have to stack up. It also provides a nice heal with that synergy, but it's mainly used for the major protection. And then Soul Siphon for the healing, very, very nice. It also gives out major vitality, so you actually get more heals than what the tooltip indicates here. It also provides another synergy, which also provides an additional heal. So if you just want a raw healing ultimate, Soul Siphon is the one to go for. Moving on to other flex abilities here. You have Absorb Magic, which gives you a little bit of additional mitigation when you're blocking, and it also heals you if you get hit by a spell projectile while the shield is up. Not particularly useful in many fights, but it is useful in a couple of fights where you expect to take some magical projectile damage. On the back bar here, you can also run Blockade if you're running a staff, or if you're running a bow, you can run Endless Hail. This will help proc your enchants if you're running enchants on the back bar rather than poisons or something like that. If you're running a lightning staff back bar, Elemental Blockade is also really important to get that the off balance uptime as well. So Blockade if you're running a staff, or Endless Hail if you're running a bow for the enchant proc. Moving on to the Fighters Guild line. You have Silver Leash for the chain, so do note that it costs stamina, so just be mindful of that. This does have pretty much the exact same range as Unrelenting Grip does on a DK, so pretty much the only difference here is the fact that it uses stamina, and it doesn't return the stamina to you if you can't pull an enemy. You have Circular Protection for the minor protection. This does cost quite a bit of stamina to use here. Very similar to Bolstering Darkness here, where it has a very small radius, it's 5-meter radius, so it's only really useful on stacked fights. Under the Sigil Order line, you have Deep Thoughts if you want to get some resources back. If you're running Mirage, this will be your source of Major Ward, Major Resolve, so you don't really need to run Balance this way. You can also run Balance and then drop Mirage if you would like, but if you want to drop Bounce for Deep Thoughts, you can certainly do so. Deep Thoughts restores Magicka stamina and health, so you don't have to give up health for Magicka by running Balance that way. And then pretty much all the abilities under the Undaunted line are flex spots, so energy orbs for additional combustion. It's also a fairly nice heal, it can help proc Symphony. Bone Search for the major vitality from the synergy. Shadow Soak for the damage synergy, the Black Widow synergy. It was changed in Elsweyr, but it's still fairly strong. Overflowing Altar for the Blood Feast synergy, as well as the Minor Lifesteal. It's going to be a little bit stronger on a healer because the Minor Lifesteal does scale off of healing done, so it's going to be a little bit stronger on healers, but if neither healer can run it, then an off-tank can also run this as well. You have Vigor as another form of self-heal and other heals. And then under the support line, you have Efficient Purge if you have to purge anything off of you, and then you also have Replenishing Barrier as another ultimate on the front bar. Both of these abilities, if you have the Magicka 8 passive, will give you some additional Magicka regen. Moving on to our CP points. CP cap is still 810, they haven't changed it at all, so it's still 270 points across each of our different constellation nodes. Starting off with green CPs, 64 Arcanist, 49 Tenacity, 66 Shadow Ward, 40 Tumbling, and 40 Warlord. 11 points into Sprinter. We have 11 points left over, which don't really fit anywhere too well, so you can really put those 11 points wherever you'd like. You can also use them to push Arcanist up to 75 for that additional 1% Magicka regen. Under the blue CPs, the only points that matter are going to be Blessed and Elfborn. About 100 into both of these, and then you can put the remaining points really however you like. The blue CPs are more geared towards just raw damage. So I have, for example, 31 Precise Strikes, 8 Piercing, and 31 Mastered Arms, but you can play around. You can even put all of them into Precise Strikes if you're running Vigor to increase your critical healing down with Vigor. For our red CPs, this is a generalist approach, so this will give you good mitigation across all pieces of content, but it's not necessarily going to maximize mitigation. So you do need to put some red CP points around, shift them around, depending on the content that you're running. I have 81 Ironclad, 61 Thick Skin, and 64 into both Hardy and Elemental Defender. Alright, so that's pretty much it for all the build information. So now let's go ahead and talk about the philosophy of tanking. So tanking in ESO is more of a support role. It's less of your traditional MMO where you're just a meat shield and you just sort of absorb damage, maybe do some healing. You're really more about maximizing your group DPS in ESO. That's kind of your job as a tank. The way I think of tanks are really have 3 jobs in order of priority. 1, stay alive. Really important to do that. 2, it's also kind of tied with 1 here, is obviously maintain taunt on the boss. Then 3, once you're able to, stay alive, know the mechanics, know the strategies you have to use to kind of combat the mechanics, then you focus in on buffing your allies and debuffing your enemies. That comes from a variety of sources. So sets, you have an Armory, Claw of Yolnahkriin, skills, so for example, Lotus Fan for the minor vulnerability, and enchants as well. So your whole point of tanking, at least in ESO, is to kind of help group DPS out a little bit here. Yes, survivability is very important. If you can't survive, then you're obviously not a very good tank. But once you're able to survive, you really want to focus in on debuffing the enemy, buffing your friends, and again, that a lot of it also comes into play with sets, the kind of group support, as well as your overall abilities. So definitely focus in on making sure you can stay alive first, and then once you have mastered that, slowly transition away from less selfish sets, less selfish abilities, and more towards group-oriented sets, group-oriented abilities. So definitely, again, learn to be a tank first, and then learn to be a support. That's kind of the general rule of thumb for ESO. It's kind of hard to explain how to tank without actually showing you guys how to tank, and I've already mentioned I do not have a Nightblade tank on the live, so I can't exactly show you how a Nightblade will tank. I don't know any streamers right now that does vet trials that does it on a Nightblade tank. But you can definitely check out or ask some of the other high-end tanks. So for example, Leofa or Inigo, those guys are very good resources for just tanking advice in general. So that is it for this build video. Hope you guys found this informative. I will have links in the description below to Leofa's Twitch stream, and I don't believe Inigo has any sort of Twitch channel or YouTube channel, so I don't know if, how best to contact him if you guys aren't in the same discords as him, but definitely reach out to Leofa if you guys have any questions about tanking in general. Hope you guys found this video informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.